everybody. Let's talk about Huxley's Brave New World here as one of our example pieces of literature from the early 20th century. And this is part of what I like to call the trifecta of great dystopian novels of the early 20th century. This along with 1984, and then the other one would be Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which I haven't assigned for this class, but it's one that's definitely worth looking at. And it was influential. It was written before both Huxley and Orwell. It was influential on both of them. They both read it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But so this novel was published in 1931, and so this is right at the beginning of the Great Depression, but the influence of the First World War perhaps is more profound, I think, on it. Some contextual points worth noticing here, and there are lots, but some that really kind of stand out, I think. Huxley was concerned with the potential of mass media to turn people into, to kind of turn their brains to mush, I guess, right? In the novel, of course, the mass media, the feelies are the main one. These are like movies, except they're full sensory experiences. They have smell, they have touch, they don't have much of a story, and really they're kind of infantile in their conception, but they titillate and they entertain, and that's one thing that Huxley sort of saw coming. If you've watched the interview that Mike Wallace did with him around 1960 or so, I think it was, you'll see him discuss this a great deal. The potential that people have to use mass media to manipulate, and so that was it's an obvious concern in the early 20th century. The growth of radio, the growth of film. We're not yet in 1930s, of course, at television by the 1950s. When Huxley, was doing that interview, they were, and in some ways, his vision here was prescient of what was to come. Another, obvious influence here is mass production, the assembly line. Henry Ford has become God for these people. They refer to him as our Ford. They have cut the tops off of all the crosses and made them T's after the Model T of Henry Ford, and so he has become this like deity figure, and everything in a way is on an assembly line. The entire human life has been reduced to an assembly line. We have the scene at the beginning in the hatchery where they've got the embryos running along the assembly line. They move so many meters per day or whatever, and then they have at each meter they have treatments that are made to the decanting jars or the embryo jars to create these different classes of human being, right? And then it's not just that, though. I mean, even death is a kind of industrialized process where there are certain things that happen to the dying person. These children are brought in to be conditioned to death, right? And then, at each stage of life, each day really is determined by this kind of place that one holds in the assembly line, so to speak. This broods over kind of the entire fictional account here. World War I, to try to find the influence of this is a little more subtle. But when the director of the hatchery, or rather, I guess it's the world controller Mustafa Mond, who's talking to these young men who are, being given a kind of orientation session in the hatchery at the beginning, he talks about this thing called the 9 Years' War. And it was the 9 Years' War that really led humanity, it seems, to accept this very authoritarian system that has become the norm at that point, right? And if you look at the 9 Years' War and the brief descriptions of it, there's a lot there that looks like the First World War, right? Where essentially these sides, these different sides went in with similar goals and kind of similar outlooks, and they ended up, fighting to complete exhaustion to the point where they were willing to do anything to bring about peace. The 9 Years' War the description here, I would juxtapose this with the description of the kind of the nuclear wars in Orwell's 1984, right? The 9 Years' War is a very different looking war than the wars that are described as having created the new world in 1984. So I think we can see that there. I think that the consequences, the high casualties of World War I changed so many minds about warfare. The scars that people had, both physically and psychologically, from the First World War, right? They led people to say, we cannot continue with that kind of world anymore. And in many ways, the First World War, culturally at least, was more transformative than the Second World War. And in terms of like the political boundaries as well, it was much more transformative. And I think that Huxley is on to something. Of course, he's writing this before the Second World War, but the changes that this 9 years war has forced are believable when kind of juxtaposed with the First World War. Let's talk about some of the key features in the book itself. I would refer you to, and I'm just not going to I'm not going to talk about absolutely everything here. We simply don't have time in a short video to do that. But these slogans that everyone repeats, and they're conditioned to repeat them. They have them, they have this sleep training, hypnopedia, where these slogans are said to them over and over and over again. And they have these things that reinforce that so that it's become instinctual to say these things, right? And they're repeated throughout the novel. Things like a gram is better than a dam, right? Meaning, with reference to Soma, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here. But the two that I think are especially important for considering the nature of this world are everyone belongs to everyone else. That's one, right? In other words, there are no emotional attachments at all. Human relationships are in a way forbidden. At least deep emotional connections between human beings are forbidden. If you want to have a sexual partner, you simply need to kind of express your intent, and that person should reciprocate. And everyone is kept young and healthy and attractive, and so there's really no incentive to get tied down to a specific individual. And everyone has essentially the same emotional makeup as well, because they're conditioned to do so. So everyone belongs to everyone else is one. And when John the Savage comes on the scene, that kind of upsets some of it, because he becomes preferred, certainly by someone like Lenina Crow, to everyone else, and that causes pain. It causes emotional distress, and they're ill-equipped. In fact, they're completely unequipped to handle that kind of thing, because they've been conditioned, the other way. The other slogan that stands out to me, at least, is everybody's happy now, right? That the goal here is happiness. Now, the word happiness is really kind of relative, of course, and I think that Huxley acknowledges that. But this state, this supposedly utopian but really dystopian state that's been created, has proclaimed to everyone that its chief purpose is to make everyone happy. Well, what's involved in that happiness? Well, it's that they don't have to work that hard, they don't have to exert themselves very much, and they have all kinds of entertainment which they're conditioned to desire and enjoy, as well as all of the sex that they can handle. Right? And if anything goes wrong in their lives, they've got Soma, this wonder drug, to give them a break from it, which causes either, a kind of feeling of euphoria, or it simply puts them to sleep, or it can even cause hallucinations, as we see in the account of the Solidarity Service, kind of in the middle of the book. Conditioning is absolutely important. It's absolutely vital to understanding this. Let's look at the text quickly here. The first couple of chapters, of course, are about conditioning. The conditioning that happens, first of all in embryo, but then when they're children. And there's this kind of horrific scene where all of these small children they're dressed in khaki, so they're identified as deltas. You've got the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the deltas, and the epsilons. The epsilons being the lowest class. They do the the most menial labor, but they're conditioned to like that, right? So this is a group of Delta children, and they come in and they have these books and flowers presented to them, and they all start, I mean, these are just babies. They start to crawl toward them. They're cooing happily. And then, suddenly these sirens are set off, and the children start screaming, and then the director says, now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock. And these children are then twitching on the floor, being shocked over and over again, and then they present the books and flowers to them again, and they start screaming. And then he says that we do this, 200 repetitions of the same or similar lesson, to the point where they no longer have any desire to read, or to enjoy nature at all. But then it's like, well, yeah, but we need them to go into the countryside. That's true, but we condition them to consume transport. They don't actually have to look at nature, so we keep them in windowless carriages, but they need to consume transport. This is all, of course, how the economy works. And we condition them to love, where does it say this? To love country sports. So they need to go out there and do, play these complicated games that involve, the purchase of a lot of equipment and things. So the conditioning, and that's just one example of conditioning. Conditioning is everywhere in this book, and Huxley's really thought through how conditioning would work well and those sorts of things. Consumption's another one, and kind of talked about it already, but this is an assembly line world. It produces all sorts of things, and people are conditioned to consume on a constant basis. If they're, the more stitches, the less riches. So if your clothes wear out, you just throw them away and buy new ones. You need to, people are conditioned to love these games like, escalator squash and electromagnetic golf and centrifugal bumble puppy. I have no idea what that would even involve. But they play these things constantly. They get done with work and they go out and play these games for several hours every day. Those except for people like Bernard Marx, who are, seem to have not, their conditioning hasn't sunk in as much, and he's rather unhappy with the world, right? So consumption is all around them all the time, and they're conditioned to do this to keep the economy moving along. Control of emotions, we talked about already. The most important factor in this is the drug soma. Huxley talks about drugs in the video, the interview he did with Mike Wallace. Huxley himself did experiment with psychedelic drugs and things like that back in the 40s and 50s. He was interested in this as a topic, but soma is a way to just achieve release from any sort of emotional distress. The sexual morality of Brave New World is one of the most, certainly in the 1930s, one of the most shocking features of this, but one of the most notable features for any age reading this, that children are encouraged to play sexually with each other, right? They're encouraged to be completely infantile in their sexual desires and their sexual practices, that if they feel the urge, they should have sex, and they shouldn't deny that at all. And everybody belongs to everybody else, and as I said, everyone is kept through the wonders of the medicine that they've produced and the kind of age defying drugs and all of the treatments and all of these things, right? They're kept young and healthy and attractive, and so they're constantly having sex with each other, and the morality has become promiscuity. At one point, Fanny says to Lenina, as they're talking, she's like, well, you really ought to be a little more promiscuous. You ought to make an effort, right? It's the correct thing to do. You've only had sex with Henry Foster for the last couple of months. That just won't do. That is immoral. And then this notion of marriage and the smuttiest word in this world is mother and birth and parents and things like that. They have turned the traditional morals, the traditional family, into the most pornographic thing that anyone can think of, which is a strange twist. But it's all in keeping with this kind of control of the emotions. Infantile behavior, we already talked about. Death conditioning there's the kind of horrific scene where John visits his mother Linda, who is dying, and the nurse is just totally flabbergasted by this. Like, why would you care about this gross woman who's about to die? And these children come in and they're getting ice cream because it's a death day, and they're being conditioned to not fear death and all of that, right? That's an important part of this. So you have no emotional attachments to people. When people die, they are recycled for phosphorus, and they're put into the ground as fertilizer, and it doesn't matter whether they're an alpha, a beta, a gamma, a delta, an epsilon, right? They're all for that. And so this conditioning extends to all relationships and even to death. God and Shakespeare, right? This is what Huxley, through the character John mostly, challenges this new morality with. John is he's been raised in this native reservation with his mother Linda. She was a beta who got stuck in the native reservation on a kind of tourist trip, and ended up pregnant and had this child, and then she couldn't go back because it was too scandalous to have a baby. That would be like committing the absolute worst sin in the world, and then re-emerging with it all over with it obvious that what you've done into society, and she simply can't do this. And so Linda's stuck there with John, raising him, and she tries to teach him to read, but then they find this complete works of William Shakespeare in a chest somewhere, and she's like, well, this isn't civilized literature, but at least you can practice reading with it. And he absorbs Shakespeare and pretty much memorizes the entire Shakespearean corpus and uses that to interpret the world around him. And, this just runs completely afoul of the new morality in the Brave New World, right? In fact, the quote, or the title of the book, Brave New World, is taken from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Right at the end of that book, you have the character Miranda and her father Prospero, and Miranda has never lived in settled society. She's always lived with her father. And she, meets all of these people from Europe, and they're going to take her back. And she says, oh, brave new world that has such people in it, right? And John initially says this, but then he, of course, becomes completely disenchanted by all of this and tries to use Shakespeare to make meaning of what's really going on, and even to convince others. And they simply can't do it. At the death scene of Linda, he goes out and starts destroying the soma rations that are being given out and proclaiming freedom to this group of gammas or deltas or whatever. And this just doesn't work. The people don't know how to deal with this. Of course, God has been taken out of the picture. One of the key moments in the book is right at the end when it's chapter 17, when Mustafa Mond, one of the world controllers, really one of the guys who calls the shots, and can violate all of the laws. Really, there's a great hypocrisy among these people. World controllers are essentially people who didn't fit in, who become convinced that the rest of society should live by these things. And so Mustafa Mond is in that position. So he has read Shakespeare. He knows about God. He knows about theology. He may even be a believer in God. But he says this just doesn't work, and he tries, John is trying to convince him that they ought to have a world where people have to suffer and they have to do without, and that provides meaning for people. In other words, you have to have opposites in order to enjoy happiness. You have to know what sadness is. Mustafa Mond says, well, civilization, you have to have kind of simple pleasures, for sure. Where does he say this? Our civilization has chosen machinery and medicine and happiness, right? And he says, well, people have no solitude now, right? You think about God when you're alone or when you're old or something like that, right? Nobody's ever, we have no solitude, and we've conditioned people to not want solitude. John's response to this, and this is one that really stood out to me in this reading. I've read this book, I don't know how many times, 10 times or something like that. It's one of my favorite novels ever, I think. But John says, value dwells not in particular will. It holds his estimate and dignity as well, wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. Now he's quoting Shakespeare here. But really, he is expressing what Socrates said about the good and about the forms in the Republic. In other words, the things that really matter are the things that have their own intrinsic value, John says. And that would be things like truth. That would be things like God. That would be things like, science is brought into this, or beauty, or justice, right? And Mustafa Mon just says, come, that's going rather far, isn't it, right? He says, what you're doing now is just degrading to human life, right? But industrial civilization, Mustafa Mon responds, is only possible when there's no self-denial. We have to have, if we're going to have industrial civilization and produce things, people cannot deny themselves, or the wheels of production would be, come churning to a halt, or at least be severely compromised. Okay? And passion means instability, and so we have chosen stability over all of this. And then there's always soma to calm your anger. Soma, he says, is Christianity without tears, right? John says, getting rid of everything unpleasant, whether it is better in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, the quote from Hamlet. But you don't do either, neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. John says, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. And Mustafa Mon says, essentially, you want to be unhappy. And John says, yes, I want to be unhappy. And then we have this final chapter where, Mustafa Mon conducts an experiment. Can John remain? Well, just remain. Can he exist in this world, or can he be corrupted by it? And of course, the answer is he can be corrupted by it. That's what happens at the very end, right? It is too powerful for him to exist in the world, and he simply cannot exist. Therefore, what happens at the end, and I won't spoil it if you haven't read it, what happens at the end happens because of that. This is the result of an experiment by Mustafa Mon. That's one of the most dystopic things that I think anyone could read, is the failure of John to exist in defiance of this world, right? So God and Shakespeare are killed effectively because John doesn't succeed and the world remains in dystopia. All right, this has gone on a little long, so hopefully that gives you a decent sense of the book and some of the important themes in it. This is one that we should be able to have some really good conversations about.